talk with you about planning your garden layout. One of the most fun things about having a garden is thinking about what we want to grow and, more importantly, what we want to be able to eat from our gardens this season. When I ask people to think about what they want to grow, most people think about vegetables that grow best in the heat of the summer. Things like tomatoes, cucumbers, zucchinis, and stuff like that. These are hot weather crops that need the heat of the summer to grow best. I'm going to show you that you can get 3 seasons worth of harvest from your gardens with a little planning. It doesn't matter if you're new to gardening or if you're a seasoned pro, planning around your summer crops is the best place to start the planning process. Look at it this way. We aren't going to be able to plant our summer crops in our gardens until mid to late May. So wouldn't it be great if we could grow some things that like the cooler weather while we're waiting for the ground to warm up enough for our summer crops? We can also do this at the end of the growing season and grow some cool weather crops after the heat of the summer has passed. We just might be able to have 3 different growing seasons. And we can be harvesting fresh vegetables starting sometime in April all the way through and into November. Here's a list of what I want to grow in my garden this season, and you'll see that I've separated what I want to grow into 3 seasons that I think things will grow best in. To show you how this works, and without getting too overly complicated, I'm going to do a deep dive and show you how I go about the planning process with one of my garden beds. After we go through that, I'll show you what my plans are for the rest of the garden beds this year. The first thing I did was draw a scale model of my garden beds. You can get as particular or not about this as you want. It's up to you. But here's what I did. The summer crops I want to grow in this garden bed are Roma tomatoes, zucchini squash, delicata squash, and garlic. The first thing we have to understand is how big these plants will be when they're fully grown. If we buy plants at our local greenhouse or farm stand, they come with instructions that tell us how big the plants will get and how far to plant them apart. If we grow plants from seeds, the seed packets will tell us how much space to leave between plants, which lets us figure out how big the plants are going to get. Now, I've drawn a scale model of one of my raised beds. It's about 7 foot by 12 foot with a center path in the middle for walking, and we'll use this garden in our example. Here are the summer crops drawn in. Now, the garlic was planted last fall, and it will be ready for harvest sometime in August, right around when the zucchini will overrun them. Now, the seed packets for the Roma tomatoes tell me that they should be started indoors in early April, and that they'll be ready to plant in the garden at the end of May. These tomatoes should be spaced 18 to 24 inches apart, so I'm going to use the middle value of 20 inches as my guideline for these tomatoes. I've left a 3 foot by 8 foot area for zucchini and should be able to grow a single zucchini plant in that area because they do grow big. Zucchini plants don't like to have their roots disturbed, so I plant seeds directly in the ground rather than to plant them a few weeks ahead of time indoors. The time you save just isn't worth it, and I've tried this. I've tried planting these indoors a few years in a row, and the seeds planted outdoors always do better. The ground and weather will be warm enough to plant seeds in the middle of May. Delicata squash are one of my favorites, and they're very similar to zucchini in terms of how and when to plant them. Like the zucchini and all my other summer squash plants, I'll plant seeds directly into the garden in the middle of May. I'll plant 2 delicata squash plants in this area. These plants grow like vines, and they'll also climb, so I'll have to loop them back on themselves to keep them in their area, but that shouldn't be a problem. The seed packet says that we should plan to get 5 to 7 squash per plant. If we keep track of the fruit, we can remove any fruit that try to grow after we hit our magic number. Now that we understand what our garden will look like toward the end of the summer, let's turn the calendar back and think about what this garden is going to look like in mid-May when we're ready to plant our zucchini and delicata squash seeds. The squash seeds need almost no room right now, but we know these plants will grow toward the sun, so the seeds will be planted here because the plants will most likely grow in this direction. If we fast forward to the end of May when we can plant the Roma tomato plants, these plants will be really small, only about 6 or 8 inches in diameter. For the squash and the tomatoes, these plants won't need the room we've set aside for them for at least another month, maybe even longer. So we want to think about putting our spring plants in the areas that these plants don't need yet. When our summer plants grow and need the room, we can simply harvest our spring plants and get more out of our garden spaces. Plants that we could put in and around our summer crops are, for example, radishes, lettuce, spinach, broccoli, kale, bok choy, etc. Let's look at two of these, radishes and lettuce, to keep things simple. Radishes are planted as seeds directly in our gardens, and they take 4 to 6 weeks to be ready for harvest. Closer to 6 weeks when the weather's cooler, closer to 4 weeks when the weather's warmer. The seed packets say we should plant the radish seeds about 3/4 inch deep and 2 inches apart, and that the rows should be about 1 foot apart. We think about where our squash plants will be planted, and growing in May, we can plant radishes right next to where the squash seeds will be, because the radishes will be harvested well before the squash needs the real estate. Lettuce takes 45 to 60 days to grow, but we gave them a head start by starting them indoors. Lettuce should be planted about 16 inches apart, so if we mark the center spot where each tomato plant is going to be planted later, we simply work around those locations to figure out where to plant our lettuce. And using 16-inch spacing between plants, we can make things work pretty well. This gives us the opportunity to grow and harvest plants that like to grow in cool weather before our hot weather vegetables need the space. By the time we hit the end of June or so, these plants will all be harvested, freeing up the space for our hot weather plants to grow into the room that we set aside for them in the beginning. Now that we have spring and summer planned out, let's turn toward the fall and see what we can do to get even more from our gardens. And just like we did in the spring, we'll be looking for plants that like the cool weather. Our zucchini plant will be done after about 2 months and will need to be removed, freeing up room for other vegetables, one of which is carrots. One of the things I learned early on is that I liked the taste of carrots from the garden when I grew them as a fall crop rather than as a spring crop. It turns out that carrots sweeten up naturally when they're exposed to a frost, and that's exactly what happens when you grow them as a fall crop. Carrots are also good companion plants for tomatoes, but more on that another time. I plant carrots between my tomato plants in August. The tomato plants will shade the carrots from the heat of the summer, and when the weather cools off, the tomatoes will be finished, giving the carrots full sun in the cooler weather. So we can plant radishes, lettuce, carrots, and other cool weather plants after the heat of the summer is gone to get more out of our gardens, and this is what our 3-season garden looks like. If you remember, I told you that I was going to go through the planting process I used for one of my raised beds. Here's what the rest of my garden is going to look like in the spring, in the summer, and in the fall this year. And a few years ago, because I wanted more space, I decided to do the same thing in the flower bed in front of my house. This bed is populated with perennial flowers and bulbs that come out in the spring, but there isn't a lot of activity in the summer. So a few years ago, I started planting butternut squash there, and we got a ton of them because the area gets a lot of sun. The following year was a COVID summer, and we had our grandkids living with us, so I decided to grow big pumpkins. And even though it's not an efficient use of space, the pumpkins are amazing, and they're now a regular in the garden and will be for a while. One last thought. While this all looks great on paper, remember that in practice it never turns out exactly the way it looks on paper. There are always hiccups, and you have to adapt and improvise all the time. It's all part of the experience of gardening. And now that we have our garden area figured out, the next step is to get our soil ready, which is the topic of our next video.